1988, the Stafford Act was passed. And since then, emergency management has been more and more centralized. Since 9/11 and the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security, this centralization of emergency management has grown into a vastly tentacled beast that reaches deep into American cities and towns and communities. And rather than protecting citizens from the effects of disasters, it has instead systematically undermined local and state sovereignty. What is happening with FEMA? Now is the time for good men to get angry. I'm going to explain this FEMA situation for you. Look at this article. Local Sheriff Kevin White wrote on social media Tuesday about Franklin County Manager Kim Denton, saying she has displayed a grotesque lack of leadership. The issue appears linked to a letter that Denton sent to county management on Thursday, October 3rd about reimbursements for funds spent on Hurricane Helene relief. The letter said that Denton would need to approve spending in advance of deployment. Can't send any help yet because it's not approved. Is the problem. Let's look at this tweet right quick from Donald Trump earlier. It has just come out that Democrats in Washington and the Democrat governor's office of North Carolina, that would be Roy Cooper, were blocking people and money from coming into North Carolina to help people in desperate need. Biden knew about it and so did Kamala. It's all over the place. A horrible situation. Stafford Act of 1988, formerly known as the Robert T. Stafford Disaster Relief and Emergency Assistance Act, is a U.S. federal law that provides the legal framework and establishes the federal government as the primary provider of federal disaster response and recovery efforts following an official declaration of a disaster. Now, what's funny about this could include anything from snow removal to settling migrants to fires, big fires, or, floods, hurricanes. The act allows state and local governments to receive federal assistance. And when we say assistance, we mean mostly in the form of money. When a disaster overwhelms the city or the region or the state's capacity to respond, the act gives the president the authority to declare a major disaster or an emergency, which triggers federal aid and then the mobilization of resources such as funds, equipment, and manpower to supplement state and local efforts. Then you have the major disaster declaration. That's reserved for more serious events like hurricanes, earthquakes, or large-scale terrorist attacks, where a broad range of federal assistance is needed for long-term recovery. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, is the primary agency tasked with coordinating the federal response under the Stafford Act. Okay, the Stafford Act came in 1988. The Department of Homeland Security came after 9/11. Right? Remember, nobody voted for the Department of Homeland Security. And in fact, the Department of Homeland Security and FEMA, these are unconstitutional organizations to start with. That's a different conversation. Maybe we'll have that another day. But FEMA manages federal resources. That means funds, personnel, logistical support. And FEMA works in conjunction, or is supposed to work in conjunction with state and local governments. We'll tell you why they're not doing that in just a minute. And so the Stafford Act establishes a cost-sharing structure where the federal government covers at least 75% of the disaster recovery costs. So that's interesting because the government just offered the people of the region $750. So what that really means is that in this disaster declaration, it was determined somewhere that $1,000 per person was justified. That would be enough because the state and local governments would cover the remaining 25%. Now, in extraordinary circumstances, the federal share can be increased. There's also public assistance, funding, and resources to state and local governments for debris removal, emergency protective measures, and repair, replacement, restoration. This is what FEMA is supposed to do. They're also charged with helping individuals, direct aid to individuals and households affected by disasters. Also, unemployment benefits. That's another thing that FEMA would cover in a case like this. Grants. Grants that are given to municipalities and cities and city councils to improve infrastructure, to implement preventative measures, mitigation programs, This is Amy Laporte. She researches and writes about federalism and disaster management. She's worked in this industry before. She saw the problems. She's contributed chapters to several books, including Government Responses to Crises. Her PhD is in public policy. Is the Chief Operating Officer at Dissident Media. Speaking of that, here we go. Dissident Media, the failure of emergency management. Now, what about FEMA's response in North Carolina? What you can see and you should see is that you can draw a straight line from the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security and what you see today happening in the mountains of North Carolina. Traditional disaster planning was traded in for a sexier Homeland Security model, one that made the typical local responder feel like they're fighting Al-Qaeda. In other words, what she's saying there is that what this has actually done, it has turned responders against the people they're supposed to be relieving and rescuing. She says, writes, with the see something, say something mission, and then flush with Homeland Security dollars, millions and billions of dollars, emergency management organizations have morphed into something unrecognizable. Emergency management has been federalized. The federal government has gradually centralized emergency management, effectively undermining local and state sovereignty, local and state autonomy. By bribing local authorities with money, Washington has imposed a top-down approach that strips localities of their ability to respond to crises according to their unique needs, acting outside of the interest of the locals, the people that live there. What they're really interested in is the grants. Money, money, money. They believe that money solves all problems. So the consolidation of power and the centralization of fiscal responsibility. This reflects this broader pattern of federal overreach. Remember these tentacles? They're all around you now. This is why we say to you so often, you need to be more aware, more focused on your local government and your own neighbors, because that's where American sovereignty is going to be breached first, locally. And that's because this federal overreach that's found its way into the localities disregards the single most important aspect of a disaster response, and that is local knowledge. FEMA doesn't have intimate local knowledge of the places where these floods happened. So how could their response be effective? Moving on, emergency managers are also easily influenced. See, beyond the funding, the federal government has also used other tactics to influence local emergency management, particularly by reshaping the types of individuals that hold these positions. It's clear they aim to place people more aligned with centralization. In other words, they intend to put people in there who are politically more left-leaning, perhaps socialists. People who have a natural tendency to favor huge government that's all into all of your business. So for more than 20 years, FEMA has spearheaded efforts to professionalize emergency management through higher education programs. They're not being trained in emergency management, they're being trained in bureaucracy, how to write grants, how to evaluate grant proposals. The outcome of all this has been a new wave of emergency managers, younger, very highly educated, and increasingly female emergency managers. Characteristics often linked with a preference for expanded federal control. All right, this increase of public emergencies, of declarations of emergencies, really took off after the passage of the Stafford Act in 1988. And then, of course, after 9/11, it really accelerated. As I just told you, in 2019, we had 27 national emergencies in effect. The reason that they do that is because it gives them more powers. After 9/11, when terrorism and homeland security concerns became intertwined with natural disaster preparedness. Now, as federal agencies like FEMA expanded their scope and influence, the number of declared emergencies kept rising, and this allowed the federal government more control over your lives, specifically over your local governments, over your local resources. And this shift has sparked criticism of federal overreach, obviously, And it also has contributed to this increasing centralization of disaster management. Now, why is this important, and why do we attach this to communism? In China and in the Soviet Union, Lenin and Mao, they just took the land from the landowners. They just took it from them. Here, it's all been legalized. Give you loans, give you money, much money, and then before you know it, you're dependent on them. Same thing is happening in America. They're just not stealing it. They're doing it legally. This is bureaucracy at its worst. But what is crystal clear is that neighbors, volunteer firefighters, and good Samaritans, these are our best hope. Our best hope is you. It's me. It's all of us. We're our best hope when it comes to this. We got to break the addiction. We got to break our local government's addiction to federal grants. And this has been going on for many decades, so it seems like it's going to be hard to do. So you better prepare accordingly. You better be getting involved with your local government. So once again, to be perfectly clear, the greatest threat to American sovereignty right now is Americans. So when it comes to the United Nations, like the Pact for the Future, the World Health Organization's pandemic treaty, or the new international health regulations, none of those plots are of any effect in the United States of America unless other Americans are willing to enforce them on other Americans. It's local is where you got to be looking first. It's going to be your neighbor.
They want everybody to focus on something that they really can't affect change on, because they want us all looking over there versus how, you can go to your town hall meeting and get to know your sheriff and your people locally and try to educate them about what's really going on, and try to get some, people who will try to keep the gate down, not let these elements come into your community. Yeah, by putting up a people gate, a fence within our local communities.
We can prevent their influence from reaching us locally.
One thing that I wanted to share with you guys tonight is, again, something written by 009, The World Is Not Enough. The destruction of America and the West is being accomplished by several nefarious methods. Funneling taxpayers' dollars into useless wars of attrition, flood the West with immigrants, people that are not legal, neglect development and infrastructure. So we can all look around and see that many of our roads have potholes, our infrastructure is not being upheld, bridges, tunnels, sewage, power plants, and transportation. China has 46,000 kilometers of high-speed rail compared to the USA, which has none. Send all the jobs and factories overseas to China, Indonesia, India, and other Asian countries. This began in the 70s when Kissinger famously went to China and made a deal with Mao, transfer the wealth of America to globalists. This happened in 2 phases so far, in the subprime mortgage crash of 2008 and during the pandemic, when the big box stores stayed open and the lockdowns bankrupt thousands of small businesses. Flood the West with inexpensive, toxic opioids like fentanyl and easy to get, in order to create a subculture of homeless people and disaffected, marginalized youth. Create intense polarization on social media to deflect social unrest away from the architects of the controlled demolition of Western civilization. Keep the left and the right in a state of perpetual fury through false flag trigger events, such as opening ceremonies of the Paris Olympics that was intentionally designed to trigger conservatives, Christians, and anyone else that still has morals and sanity. The process being employed at this moment is a strategic manipulation by agencies, stakeholders working with the federal government and NGOs that are designed to entrap locals and incrementally dissolve the autonomy of state and local governments, which have been happily accepting grants, not noticing that they're walking off a cliff. The creation of regional supergovernments serves as a transitional phase, blurring the lines between public and private. Understand that right now, we are under attack. The American way of life is under attack. Our government has been captured. This is happening to us right now. And this is a communist takeover that's happening. They are collapsing the West systematically. If you want a future for your children, We have to get involved, guys.
Well said. That's perfect. It is time for all of us out here to wake up, crowing and boasting, day after day about the Constitution and your God-given rights to life, liberty, and property, especially free speech, is a meaningless endeavor unless you're willing to defend the principles enumerated within that document. The Constitution is the standard of liberty. It's the rule. It's the rod. It's what defines and limits governmental authority. It's what secures your human rights. But what secures the Constitution? The sword secures the Constitution. The Second Amendment. So the Constitution secures your rights, and it's your duty to secure the Constitution by engaging in, first, debate and your civic duty in times of peace, and increasingly, in times of war, when your security is under attack, then you have to fight. That's what that Constitution says. That's how it works. That's how freedom works.
This is the emergency broadcast system. This is not a test. Repeat, this is not a test. Citizens are advised to take the following steps.
Find us, armoroftruth.net.